tonight's meeting and what's happening in the world, and our weekly Torah portion. This week is Parashat Yisro, the Jewish people of having left Egypt, received the Torah from Hashem. And we know in Judaism there are many laws, rituals, customs, so much complexity to our religion. But is there an underlying theme to the whole of the Torah? And there is. And that is the purpose of our Torah, of our religion, is to elevate ourselves and reality to a higher plane, to not only suppress evil, but to literally transform darkness to light, or in the words of the Zohar, to bitterness to sweetness, to be able to realign ourselves with our divine source. And in fact, last week we commemorated Holocaust Memorial Day, 76 years ago to the day, the Nazis who brought a living hell on earth to our people, as well as hundreds of thousands of others. It was brought to an end in Auschwitz, the liberation of Auschwitz. And the theme this year was being a light in the darkness. And there are many examples of people being a light in the darkness during that dark period of the Holocaust and throughout our history, being a beacon of inspiration. But tonight, I would like to say, Dr. Wollschlaeger, having read a little bit about you and having spoken to you at length on the phone, that you've taken being a light in the darkness to a new level, which is transforming darkness itself into light. And we hope to hear this story of yours this evening, and God willing, to share it with others, as well as hopefully uplift us, because we are living in dark times yet again. And I think we need stories like yourself to hear about how it's possible to make some sort of transformation in our lives, so that we too can find hope within ourselves, because we all have dark places, we all have places that need transforming, and that's why we have invited you this evening to speak to us. So thank you so much. And just to explain to the audience, the chat function is open to ask questions to the host, which is me. And so at the end of Dr. Wollschlaeger's talk, we will be able to ask questions through the chair, because there's quite a few of us this evening. And we look forward to a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erev Tov. It's still cold but sunny in Florida. For us, cold is like being below 10 degrees Celsius. So I guess you have a different cold sensors in London. I had a technical problem with my camera, so I want to make sure that everybody can hear and see me. If there's a problem, let me know. Yesterday, I always blew the fuse out of my computer for too many calls. But if you see me and hear me, I'm okay. Is this okay? Benny, everything is fine?
Yes, everything is good.
Okay.
We can see you clearly.
So why I'm talking about my life? Why Bernd Wollschlaeger talks about his life? People ask me that. And I actually chose not to talk about my life because it was too complicated to explain it. Or I was afraid to explain it. Until my son Tal, he's now 31 years old, but he was 15 at that time, asked me a simple question. Dad, who is my grandfather? And I didn't know how to answer this question, because how should I explain to a nice Jewish boy who is going to Jewish school from the beginning to the end, elementary school, high school, and graduated with honors, how to explain to him that yours truly, me, is a Jew, an Israeli, and served in the Israeli army, whereas my father, his grandfather, was a highly decorated World War II German tank commander and convinced National Socialist. These two worlds I was unable to reconcile at that time when he asked me the question, but after thought, I decided to talk in order to explain my son. Who am I and what our family is about? Well, all life story begins at the time and place of your birth. And I was born in May the 9th, 1958, in a gorgeous city in Germany called Bamberg, to use the proper German pronunciation. Bamberg is a medieval city, 1,000 years old, never touched by any wars, located between Nuremberg and Würzburg in Bavaria, or we call it Franconia in that part of Bavaria, and full of history, packed full of history. And from the age of 6 years on, beginning of elementary school, we walked with our teachers to the city to identify famous places, who lived where, what the dome is about. And so it was a sense of history all around us, and we learned that. But there was something about the history that was not talked about, and not because I was smarter than the others, but because I noticed that there's certain aspects of our life nobody wanted to answer. For example, in a city of 75,000, there were about 10,000 American soldiers and family members. And I knew that there was a war. We as children knew a war took place at one time. But what kind of war we didn't. But I knew that in the war, people win and people lose. And the fact that there were 15,000 American soldiers in our town means we didn't win that one. So that I figured out. When I asked my parents about my past, our past, specifically the fact that I didn't have grandparents either, I was told by my parents they're gone because of the war. So the war played an essential role, but nobody wanted to talk about it. Slowly but surely, my parents woke up to the necessity to tell me about their lives, and I to understand what their lives was about, because it was very different lives that they both lived, and also necessity to explain to me what happened to our family. And when my father started talking, he never stopped. On long walks that we had on Friday and Sunday night evenings, mornings, until the evening in the forest, he taught me how to handle a rifle, how to shoot, how to preserve nature. I had a very close relationship with him. And he told me on these long walks that he was the youngest tank commander in the German army, serving under the command of General Guderian, the father of the German Blitzkrieg. And my father was literally his student. And on every battlefront that that Germany opened, my father's tanks were the first to roll in fast. So September the 1st, 1939, my father's tanks rolled into Poland. Next year, the attack on France, Belgium, and Holland, my father's tanks were the first to roll in. And Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the attack on the former Soviet Union, my father's tanks were the first to roll in too. And they're pushing forward. Actually, my father's tanks pushed forward until until a city of Orel that was about 250 miles away from Moscow. And for conquering the city Orel, my father was awarded the Knight's Cross by a man whom he still adoringly referred to as his Führer, Adolf Hitler. I had no idea what Adolf Hitler meant. I didn't know what my Führer meant, but what it meant that my father was the knight in shining armor, the hero. And this message that my father was a hero, the knight in shining armor, was reinforced by his old war buddies who came to at least once a month to our house and celebrating the good old times and referring to my father, Arturo, his first name was Arthur, our hero, and that I, yours truly, should be proud of his father. So I was proud of him. There was no other reference point. On the other hand, my mother didn't tell me the story of glory. She told me the story of horror. And the horror was that she was born an ethnic German in Karlsbad in the Sudetenland. In this territorial area located the border to Czechoslovakia, there were about 1.5, 2 million ethnic Germans lived there for generations. And as a result of the war, they were all evicted, many of them killed in a genocide. And my mother barely escaped with the gun in her hand that my father provided her, with the instructions, if the Russians approach you, you shoot yourself. And lost everything, her grandparents, her sense of security, the beautiful villa that they had in Carlsbad, the manufacturing business of my grandfather, everything gone. So for my father, glory, for my mother, horror. But there was something else about that war that nobody wanted to talk about it either, even not at that time. That had to do with our house, ironically. We were living in the ground floor of a big, huge patrician-style building that is still standing there, 19th century Bauhaus style. And the entire second floor was occupied by the landlady. And my mother told me she's a noblewoman and I should not talk to her unless spoken to. And right next to this wooden stairways leading upstairs to the landlady's apartment in the corridor, right up across from the wooden stairway was a painting mounted on the wall depicting an officer in uniform with the officer's cap, the insignia of a colonel on his shoulders, and the knight's cross around his neck. I knew that this was not my father's picture, even though I saw my father's in uniform too, but it was somebody else. And when I asked my father who this man was or is on the picture, on the painting, my father referred to him as the traitor, and I should not ask him about this treason. He is somebody I should not learn from. Well, I was confused. How can it be that a man who looks like my father in a uniform is a bad person, and my father who looks like him in a uniform is a good person? Very simple question of a child. Until I found out from the lady upstairs that her name was Nina von Stauffenberg, and the portrait was her husband, late husband, Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, the German colonel who was leading the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on the 20th of July 1944, which unfortunately failed. He was executed the same night. His widow, Nina, was thrown into a concentration camp, Ravensbrück, a concentration camp for women, and survived. And her children were given up for adoption, 3 children. And thanks to God, they were liberated on their way to Buchenwald for final treatment, meaning gassing and murdering them. And they were reunited after the war. So contrasting parts of history. And I wanted to know, it was so intriguing because my parents didn't talk about it, that whenever they were sleeping on Sunday after lunch, I sneaked upstairs because there were children playing loudly playing in the corridor and upstairs. These were the grandchildren of Nina von Stauffenberg. When I entered her apartment playing with the children, I saw this huge apartment. I can still imagine it today, with pictures, wall-to-wall pictures, photographs and paintings of her and her husband, a lovely couple. And I asked myself, how can it be that when my father is so mad about these nice people? So open questions and nobody answered. Then in 1968, I was barely 10 years old. And actually 1968, I was barely 10 years old. Something seems to change. There were demonstrations on the street. There were demonstrations by young students. I was not their age yet. And they're demonstrating against the still conservative and Nazi regime in Germany. I mean, don't misunderstand me, they were not Hitler in power, but Hitler's proteges were still in power. In specifically his former chancellor, our former chancellor, Kurt Georg Kiesinger, who was elected in 1966, was a former National Socialist and also a minister in the propaganda ministry of the National Socialist Party, and never repented. And in 1969, this post-Nazi prime minister was thrown out of office by a man whose name was Willy Brandt. And Willy Brandt was a total change in Germany, because Willy Brandt was a former socialist who had to flee Germany in 1933 from certain death, fled to Norway, and after the occupation of Norway, fled to Sweden. And from Sweden in 1949, he returned to Germany to rebuild his party, the now called Social Democratic Party, and rose to power in a landslide election in 1969. And one of his first acts as prime minister was to travel to Poland in a cold December day, 1970. And in front of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, he sank on his knees, bowed his head, and asked for forgiveness what Germany did. And this picture of the chancellor went around the world, kneeling in front of the memorial. My father was livid. He was mad and yelling and screaming and said in German, "Schau mal her, Bernd, wieder ein Verräter. Look, Bernd, again a traitor." I was confused. Kneeling in front of a memorial was something positive. Why positive? Because I grew up as an Orthodox Catholic. My mother was an Orthodox Catholic. My father was a Protestant, though. And she sent me to Catholic kindergarten, Catholic elementary school. I was an altar boy in a church. She wanted me to become a priest. Obviously, that didn't work out. And for me, kneeling in front of a memorial with all my education and religious guidance, that was something positive. Why is my father so mad? And then this chancellor, Willy Brandt, went further. He actually convinced the international allies that Germany is mature enough to host the Olympics in Munich in 1972. In 1972, the hosting of Olympics was for us, we learned in school about it, a very important symbol sent to the Western world. This was not the Germany of 1936, where Adolf Hitler abused the Olympics in Berlin for propaganda purposes. This was the new Germany, the democratic Germany. We had a communist Germany on the other side, though. The new Germany, the democratic Germany, who hosted the world, the guests from all over the world in Munich, to demonstrate we are back and we are now democratic regime, and Hitler is a thing of the past. And I remember the opening of the Olympics on a beautiful August day in 1972. My parents purchased their first TV, black and white though, invited friends over, fine food, wine, beer. Everybody was singing and joyous mood, and watching every team parading to the stadium, specifically the German or West German team. And suddenly a team paraded into the stadium carrying the flag with the star inside, the Israeli team. And in that moment, everybody stopped talking. It was the do not ask the question moment. And I said, that's weird. This is just another team. I had no idea, no reference value. It was from Norway, Sweden, or Switzerland. This was just another team. And unfortunately, this same team, the Israeli team that so proudly paraded into the stadium, was 10 days later, on September the 5th, 1972, brutally attacked by a group of Palestinian terrorists who got logistical support from the Stasi, the East German State Security unit. And they murdered, butchered 2 Israelis brutally in the Olympic Village, and the remainder of the Israelis were taken hostage. And the Olympics continued. And Germany protested because they were deeply embarrassed. The minister in the German government were deeply embarrassed that on German soil, Jews are being killed and Jews are being held hostage. So they begged the Olympic Committee to stop. They didn't stop until Germany stopped it themselves. And the highest ranking government members, including the Minister of Interior, Genscher, traveled to Munich and negotiated face to face with the terrorist leader. His name was Issa, begging them on offering their own bodies, they called them the bodies, so to say, their own colleagues, the whole members of the cabinet as hostages in lieu of the Israelis. Issa refused. He demanded to be flown out with the hostages to a nearby military airport called Fürstenfeldbruck, and demanded that Israel releases 240 or 250 terrorists, Arab terrorists, out of Israeli prisons, and demanded that they would be flown out with a German Boeing 707 to Cairo, and then in a big bombastic, or Libya, in Tripoli, in a big bombastic ceremony, the terrorists would hand over the Israeli hostages in lieu of the freed Arab terrorists from Israeli prisons. That never happened. And I remember every beat by beat what happened. I remember it clearly. In front of the cameras, we saw 2 helicopters in the nighttime taking off from the Olympic Village. Both helicopters, the hostages and the terrorists, and flying to the nearby airport called in Fürstenfeldbruck, a military airport, landing behind the closed gates of the airport, and suddenly all hell broke loose. Night sky lit by explosion, firefight lasting 2 hours almost, and we knew something bad happened. And the Mossad units under Tzvi Samir, the then chief of the Mossad, the director of the Mossad, you don't need to explain what the Mossad is, begged the Germans not to attack, that these are terrorists, highly skilled, not to attack and let the Mossad do the trading and capturing. The Germans refused. The Germans said, this is our territory, we liberate the hostages. And so it happened. Outgunned, German police tried to kill the terrorists, and ensued a firefight. And when Issa felt he was cornered in, he threw a hand grenade in one helicopter, and all the Israelis perished in a fireball. The other helicopter he sprayed with machine gun fire, and everybody died. And the next day, this picture in a newspaper that changed the direction of my life. It changed my life. 2 helicopters on the tarmac, one burned out with the charred remains of the Israelis inside, the other helicopter with the bodies of the Israelis slumped over the seats, barely covered with blood-stained linen, and a huge headline: Jews killed in Germany again. Now, I speak perfect German, and then, of course, I already spoke perfect German. So the again part, again means it happened before. I didn't get that. How? What happened before? And I remember my father screaming and yelling at home when he read the article, when he saw in the newspaper, and of course, the coverage in the media and the TV. Schau mal her, Bernd, look, what they, the Jews, do to us again. They're always troublemakers. They always bring trouble. They deserve it. I didn't understand. Such a national tragedy. My father talks like that. And in school, we started to talk not only about the events of 1972, of the September 5th and the September the 6th, 1972, and the grave impact that it had on German society, but also about how we should look at our own history. And for the first time in 1972, I heard the word Holocaust, Auschwitz, Birkenau, the murder of 6 million, not as collateral damage of war, but the murder of 6 million as a deliberate government policy of the German government. I was shocked because I never heard about it. And then I asked myself, my father, the war hero, he probably knows something about it. That must be, he can explain it to me. Well, when I came home that day, after our teachers gave the explanation what happened, I asked my father, in school, we're talking about the Holocaust. Can you explain something up to me, what happened? He looked at me sternly and said, Bernd, the Holocaust is a lie. This is Jewish and communist propaganda. Now, I was caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, my father, whom I feared and adored too. On the other hand, my teachers, whom I respected and adored too. Somebody's telling me the truth, or somebody's telling me the lie, or both lie. I don't know what to believe. And I started to read whatever I could about that time. And the more I read, I had the sinking feeling that my father knew more than he volunteered to talk about. And I decided to ask him questions. Now, a little problem. My father wouldn't answer. But I knew my father had a weakness. That was his alcoholism. And I knew as a child of an alcoholic parent, when he was looking for a drink in the late afternoon, he was restless, irritable, and discontent. When he was in La La Land, later on, you couldn't talk to him. But when he was in the twilight zone, I call it nowadays the Schicker zone, in his twilight zone, he was amenable for manipulation. I could get money out of him. And his tongue was very loose. He was cooperative. And in that zone, I struck and asked questions. And the answers came out in 3 phases. I'll paraphrase it as phase 1. Bernd, he said, whatever allegedly happened in the East during the war, we didn't do anything. We means the Wehrmacht. It was all the SS. No, it was a lie, a big lie. Because I already knew from the lady upstairs, and later, 20 years after his death, I verified that in the archives of the former East German Republic, the German Communist Republic were opened. I learned that my father was deeply involved. Every officer was involved, and my father specifically. There's a picture of him sitting next to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the head of the beast. And him sitting next to Heinrich Himmler in a conference in the East in 1942 was not about tank tactics. It was about how the German army, the Wehrmacht, could secure kill zones. And my father so knew what he was doing. Phase 2, my father and I asked him about the children that were killed in the war and the civilians that were killed in the war. He said, look, first of all, in the war there are rules. There's the Geneva Convention. And the Geneva Convention stipulates if you have civilians with weapons, you can kill them. Now, I asked him a rhetoric question. I said, you tell me that children, 1 million plus children wearing weapons to fight you, and you had the right to kill them? Don't you know that children were herded with their parents in concentration camps, gassed, their bodies burned, their ashes scattered over the killing fields of Auschwitz and Birkenau and Treblinka? You tell me that you were the most sophisticated and fiercest and biggest army in the world at that time, killed children for nothing but because they're children? He didn't answer. And then came one evening, which was the end of our relationship. He was drunk and he was combative, and he yelled at me, you are weak. Your whole generation is weak, because the world should give us a Nobel Prize, the Peace Nobel Prize, to get rid of all these vermins, of all those Jews, of all those Untermenschen. They're not people. We should get the reward, but now we're getting push from you. You're soft. You're too moral. You don't know how to fight. And that was the last word that I exchanged with my father about that topic, because the camel's back of trust was like a straw breaking on the camel's back. That was the last straw that broke, that I could identify with my father. And I turned away from him and asked one of my teachers, how can I deal with that guilt, the shame that I felt about me being a German and what Germans did? And my teacher, a former Jesuit priest who knew my father, told me, Bernd, you need to make amends to those who were harmed. I said, what do you mean amends? Amends means I need to find out where Jews are, then figure out how I get in there, then make amends. There were barely any Jews left in Germany, 25,000 maybe. And he said, well, I can arrange that for you. And he did. He belonged to a progressive wing of the Catholic Church, inviting every year a group from Neve Shalom in Israel, Jews and Arabs alike, to Germany. And I, as the German representative chosen by him, joined them. When young people get together, that was 1978, the last thing what the young people do is to talk about what separates them. We try to find what unites us. I must say, I not only try to find what unites us, I also like very much these Israeli girls. So I was not necessarily spiritually motivated only. And one of the girls who liked me a lot, and I liked her, she said, Bernd, if you want to go further in a relationship with me, you have to come to Israel. And I said, absolutely. I was a big Schwitzer. I will do that. The problem was a tiny one. I had no money and no passport. Within 3 months of her departure in the summer and in the fall, I got some money together from summer jobs. I got my first passport, and I decided to travel to Israel in a way that I do not recommend doing. I hitchhiked to Munich. From Munich, I took a train across the Alps to Italy, to Ancona. It's a port city on the Adriatic Sea. And from there, I took a ferry, sleeping on deck, not a cruise ship, going through 4 days, 3 nights through the Mediterranean, provisioning in Piraeus. And from there, I sent in Piraeus a telex and pointing out that I will arrive at this and this time and this day in Haifa. That was before Google, Schmoogle, and all the good stuff. That didn't exist yet. Can you imagine? And when we arrived in Haifa, I remember I was excited to see her across the port gate. And on the one hand, on the other hand, when I stepped off the ship on Israeli ground, I had this sinking feeling. What if somebody recognizes my name in connotation with my father, what my father maybe did to his or her family? I was full of fear. I didn't know. But all this fear and doubt was wiped away when I embraced her, and she took me by her hand, walked me to a taxi, to a community taxi, the Shod, and we drove up to a little mountain in Neve Sha'anan, in Carmel Mountain. That was at that time a working class neighborhood, and tiny little houses, and her parents were waiting outside, her father taking my rucksack and her mother my bag, chit-chatting in Yiddish with me. I had no idea what they're talking about, welcoming me like a lost son, guiding me into a small apartment that was not a house, an apartment. They all moved in one living room. There was the kitchen left and a room for me that I should stay as a guest. And in the evening, they dished all kind of food that I never saw, I never ate. Falafel, hummus, trina. And we were chit-chatting in the dinner table. I understood a little bit. And her father wanted to go further. He didn't want his daughter to translate everything. He looked at me and said in clear but halting German, Bernd, if you want to speak German, I can still speak it too. And I looked at him and said, how did you learn German? He didn't say a word. He looked in my eyes, rolled up the sleeve on his left forearm, and showed me the number tattooed. Ich war in Auschwitz. And that was the last word I had to hear. I am a young German sitting in a home of a Jewish family in Israel, a family of Holocaust survivors. What will happen now? I asked myself. And he looked at me and said, don't fear us. I have no hard feeling against your generation. I just want to know, what do you know? What do they teach you? And I honestly answered him, I don't know if they teach us everything. And he took it upon himself 2 days later to travel with me to Yad Vashem in Yerushalayim, the Holocaust Memorial. And he took me by his hand and walked me through the entire exhibit, at that time a different exhibit, and I broke down. I emotionally and physically broke down. I could not combine what I learned so far with that, what really happened. This tsunami of horror, tsunami of death. And my people did that to those people who hosted me as a guest, who did everything for me, who treated me nicely. And who are these people in a positive sense? They rebuilt their lives, they rebuilt their profession, they rebuilt an old country anew. Something fascinates me. I want to learn more about me. And on the way back to Germany, I decided that I made a plan, I will approach a Jewish community to offer my help. And so I did. I approached a small Jewish community in my hometown. Lo and behold, there were a small Jewish community of 35 members, barely a minyan on Friday and Saturday. The entrance was from behind a courtyard, hidden. And there was a glass door. I remember that you had to knock at the glass door, this beautiful glass door with beautiful inlays. And I knocked at the glass door and rang the bell, and an old man opened the door, looked at me, and said in Yiddish, was willst du? And I rambled something, I don't know what I rambled, but he felt comfortable to walk me in, to guide me into the kihile, he called it, the Stibelech. And I walked to a dark corridor, lit just barely with a light in the corner, the Ner Tamid, he told me. I didn't know what that meant, the red light. And the walls were covered by black granite plates with names engraved in golden letters. And I asked him, what does it mean? He said, well, these are all the Jews who never returned of Bamberg, who never returned from Theresienstadt, 1,000 plus. And he walked me into his little office. There was a curtain drawn, the windows closed, no air condition, no fan. It was hot. And he was wearing like this short-sleeved white shirt, and he was very pale. And his number tattooed on his left arm stood out. And he knew that I was staring at me and said, Bernd, what do you want? What it is? This is my name is Itzhak Rosenberg. This is the number that I got in Auschwitz. I'm a Holocaust survivor. So what do you want? And I told him my story. He said, it's a very sad story. But take a book or two and read about it and bring it back. He said, I don't want to read. I read everything. I want to help. I want to give something back. He looked at me and said, you're a stubborn young man. Maybe we can make a geschäft. And everything in life is a geschäft, he said. If I teach you, and I cannot teach you much, but I teach you, in return, you will be our Shabbos goy. well, Shabbos Goy, Shabbos Shmoy, I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded like a good deal. And he said, what do I have to do? I said, come on Friday night at 6 o'clock, I will explain you. I was there at 6 o'clock. He came there around 7:30, 8 o'clock. He looked at me and said, was machst du um die Zeit? What are you doing at that time? You told me 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. First thing you learn, don't be so German. Well, I did never unlearn that behavior. Anyway, he led me into the Kiele and he showed me what to do, what manual labor I needed to do, because it's an Orthodox Jewish community, of course, you know, you cannot do any labor, cannot labor during Shabbat. And so I set up the tables, the chairs, made the coffee and the tea, and made some hot meals. And he warned me, he said, this is a world for itself. This is the little world that he carved out for himself, a little Stieblech. So you will get some pushback from the alte Kacker that he said. I didn't say this term, but he told me. And indeed, when the members of the community came, they were hickering and pickering, what macht der Goy dort? And Itzhak said, look, don't listen to them. Just do what I tell you to do. And so I got there every Friday, every Saturday, week by week, holiday by holiday, year by year. And I slowly absorbed the liturgy, the mannerism, the language, the whole lifestyle. And the closer I came to this family of choice, or this group of choice, the more I separated myself from the family of origin. And it came, of course, to a breakup with my family, many different breakups, but the most important one, and the final one, was when Christmas fell on a Friday night. And Christmas in an Orthodox Catholic household is like the combination of Yom Kippur, Passover, and Hanukkah, something like that. And my mother, I can play it like a movie in my head. My mother took us to the church, to a holy mass. We returned in the same day, same night, to eat lentil soup and carb, a symbolic food for Catholics during Christmas. Then we were waiting for our father to ring the bell, to open the large oak doors leading into this huge living room that we had. My father was standing in his finest dark suit with a knight's cross around his neck next to the beautiful Christmas tree with real candles, singing festive Christmas hymns with a knight's cross around his neck. And I was not there. And when I came home the next day, all hell broke loose. And I said, look, let's stop this Greek tragedy. I will never, ever sit with you on the same table celebrating the birth of Christ with you having this blood-stained knight's cross around your neck. You're a murderer. He looked at me and said, raus, get out. Well, there was a little problem in Kesef. I was in the second to last year of medical school. I had a scholarship though, but I needed some extra money and I was running out. And I never asked in the community about money. And Itzhak must have told everybody about my predicament, because somehow it was seeping out. And one of the members of the community that I was serving already for 5 consecutive years, his name was Aaron, who never talked to me, approached me and said, Du bist der Goy. Very perceptive, Aaron, yeah. Dein Name is Bernd. I said, yes. Hör mal zu, listen. Deine Jacke und deine Schuhe sind schmutzig. Your jacket and shoes are dirty. Kauf dir neue Sachen, buy new stuff. And gave me 100 mark, which was a huge amount of money. So I was insulted and given 100 mark. I walked over to my quasi-father, Itzhak, and said, Itzhak, Aaron gave me 100 mark. Itzhak asked me, 100 mark? Did you ask him for 200? I said, no. Well, because you're a Goy. I said, what do you mean? Sit down. That was a joke. You have to understand, our emotional life is different to your emotional life. We lost everything. We lost every security, safety, everything. So we had to gradually rebuild it, and I was able to rebuild it by getting married to a wonderful German woman who converted. Aaron, we know from the Red Cross, was in Auschwitz and lost everybody. And Aaron must have sensed that he was going to die, because in the last 6 months of his life, he told me everything. And one of the stories that I just barely want to scratch was the fact that Aaron was a member of a Sonderkommando in Auschwitz. And anybody who wants to know what a Sonderkommando, would read it up. These were Jews that were given a reprieve of their life for 90 days, could eat and drink and whore around. I mean, I have to use that word, that's what Aaron told me. And in return, they had to hoard their fellow Jews into the gas chamber, gave them the number on a plastic card, and said, if you find your clothing outside with the number of the plastic card, keep the card in your hand. Then they closed the doors, and the SS threw cyanide on the top. When the screaming and banging ended, the Sonderkommando went in there with gas mask, took the body, broke everything, manual labor. Then they took gold rings and gold teeth, everything away, burned the bodies, crushed the bones, and so they remained in the pits. Aaron survived that. Other Sonderkommandos were gassed completely afterwards, after 90 days. And when Aaron died, I was in medical school. I got a call from Itzhak and said, Aaron is dead, and you have to come right now. And I came. It was an evening, and Itzhak said, look, he died in the morning. We have to bury him in the morning. We need a Cheva Kadisha. I said, and we need you. I said, I cannot do that. I'm not a Jew. Itzhak looked in my eyes. You're one of us. The next day, we buried him early in the morning, and Itzhak gave me the Kaddish, the prayer book, and said, you know how to read the Kaddish. I knew. I knew it by heart. I said, I can't do it. I'm not a Jew. I said, he was your friend. And I said the Kaddish. And that was crossing the line. I was on the other side. And I told Itzhak, I want to become a Jew. Itzhak looked at me, side eyes, showed me the number tattooed and said, don't be a fool. You can be a Ger Tzedek, but you don't have to sacrifice your life to that. We were born to die. We were born to suffer. But you can be such a Ger Tzedek, you don't have to do it. And I said, I want to do it. And he sent me to a rabbi in Frankfurt with the explicit order. He told the rabbi, I would pay him a trip. I paid him the hotel. I paid him food. Talk him out of this idea. Well, he couldn't talk me out of this idea. We agreed that we in Frankfurt, that he would see him every 3 months, and I would in between write him letters, and they would teach me. That went for 2 years. And in April '86, he finally relented to my constant nagging. I was a nutnik, and said, look, Bernd, I refer your case to the rabbinical court in Frankfurt. If they decide in your favor, lucky you, but they might not decide in your favor. But until you get there, you have to undergo already some symbolic procedures. One of them involves a little plastic surgery. I don't want to talk about it. It had to be done in a Orthodox facility, kosher facility in Switzerland, in Basel. In Germany, there was none. And then I had to emerge 3 months or 4 months later in an Orthodox mikveh in Metz, in a Hasidic community. And I returned to Germany in December 1986 and underwent a halachic conversion. And I remember it was a very touching, very emotional procedure, because the rabbis were sitting on a podium, 5 of them, with dark robes, dark hat, like judges look like. And I was sitting like a little nebbish downstairs and looking up to the Habima. And the rabbis quizzed me, and they knew everything about me. And the chief rabbi said, look, I understand, I know what you want to do, but you have to explain me in 1 or 2 sentences, why does a German want to become a Jew? And I explained it to him. And they retreated, returned after an hour, and I had to stand up. They asked me, please stand up. And they read me the Tiorat Gihur in German and in Hebrew. And it was a very emotional situation. And the rabbi looked at me and said, you know, your last name is Ben Abraham. You cannot change that. But your first name you can change. I said, what do you mean? What is your first name? I said, Bernd. Well, Bernd, what does it mean? You know that? I said, no, the lion slayer, the bear slayer. So you're Dov, take it, it's free. Second question, what do you want to do now? And I said, look, Rabbi, I'm going to Israel. Why you want to do that? I said, I have no money that I can donate. I'm still not a skilled physician yet, but I can give my life in fighting in the army. And that's what I did. I immigrated to Israel. Within 30 days in Germany, I got actually my visa to qualify me as a new Ole Chadash, as a new immigrant, according to the law of return. And in 8th of January 1987, I took a one-way flight from Frankfurt to Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion. From there, I was shipped to the kibbutz, learned Hebrew, picked bananas. If you have any question about banana cultivation, I can tell you anything about it. 6 months later, I was enrolled in a program in Ichelov to get my German license up to Israeli par, a stage program. And a month later, 12 months later, I was immediately drafted into the military. I waived any kind of waiting period, did basic training, officers training, and to my luck, October 1988 was the first month of the first Intifada, the Arab uprising. And to my luck, they sent me to Beit El. Beit El was the hotbed of the uprising. On the left-hand side, when you look down this little sloping mountain ridge where we are stationed, was the Ramallah, which was Haligali, and the Intifada was in full course. On the other side, next to them, was Beit El, the settlement, and we were in between. We call them the Freier Hill. And my commanding officer looked at me, looked at this Chevre. Look, Chevre, this is Lieutenant Dr. Wollschlaeger. You have to change your name, by the way, doctor. He is responsible for your physical health. I'm your commanding officer. If I get killed or wounded, Dr. Wollschlaeger will be the second in command. And I was standing there frozen in fear, because this is what it really is about. This is what it really is about. There's no way out. And then explaining these young soldiers that are not only the future an officer of the Israeli army, but that my father was a Nazi. If they find out, they kick me out of this group. They kick me into Ramallah. There was fears, unjustified fears. And unfortunately, I took those fears to the next level. I threw my personality, my life, his history, and everything literally in the virtual closet, slammed the door shut, turned the key in the lock, and tried to throw the key away. I denied myself to be Bernd Wollschlaeger. I wanted to live a new life, completely disengaged from my afterlife, from the previous life. And of course, it was a bad idea. And years later, my son Tal asked me this simple question: Dad, who is my grandfather? And I answered him. And my son replied, this is a cool story. Can I tell my friends? Please not. But to my luck, sort of, they had a family history day in school, my son's school. And I was not there, but I was told that my son raised his right hand, and proudly declared, my grandfather was a famous Nazi. Now, that doesn't fly well in a Jewish school. And the principal called me a 911 to the school. I entered the conference room. He was sitting there with the rabbi. He was very upset and said, Dr. Wollschlaeger, your son told us a verdrehte Geschichte that your father was a Nazi. I know there's problems in a home. You can do divorce. Maybe there are drugs. I said, Rabbi, principal, it's all true. I told him the story. And the rabbi looked at me, do you want to talk about it? I said, no, come with me. And he took me to his classroom, where my son actually was attending class too. And he said, talk. And he was right. He probably suspected that something would happen. Something happened. The weight was lifted off my shoulders. I felt free to talk about it. And I wanted to close the circle of life that I opened so many years ago. And I decided to travel to Germany with my son, which we did a few months later, to visit my parents, which actually the only way to visit my parents was to go to the cemetery. They were long gone. In the Bamberg cemetery, and this is typical for cemeteries in a rural community like Bamberg, where Jews and non-Jews live together as peasants, where Jews are buried in the same cemetery divided by the wall. And my parents' grave site is located exactly 2 rows or 1 row parallel to the wall that separates the Jewish from the Christian cemetery. And when you look towards that wall, you see on the other side the Jewish gravestones almost defiantly casting their shadow to the other side. And I told my son, I didn't know what I could tell him. I said, look, this is the irony of history. Your grandparents, my parents, are buried in the shadow of history. And I stepped out of the shadow, looking back, trying to make up and make good what they did, or at least did something positive, learning my lessons and moving forward, never to look again. And this is what I'm doing when I'm speaking. It's not about me. It's not about my personality or the lack thereof or the attempt to find attention. No, it's not me. I'm very comfortable living the way I'm living. But it is about to understand what hatred can do to people. And that's what my father taught me indirectly. That hatred is not this amorphous dark matter in the universe that nobody knows what is in there. Words causes hatred. Words of hatred, if left unchallenged, fall on a fertile ground and they grow into deeds. If those deeds are not being cut down, they form habits. If these habits prevail, characters will form. And these characters will define and determine norms. And these norms in Germany at that time were, you can kill Jews. It was normal. This was the norm. I don't let the Germans off the hook and said, well, this was a normal development. They decided to act upon it, not fighting against it, act upon it. Everybody who kills has an excuse. So did my father, but there was no excuse. And we need to understand, if you're fighting anti-Semitism, fighting hatred, fighting misogyny, fighting Muslims hatred against Muslims, it's the same thing. If we don't raise our voices when the words of hatred are being spoken, they will grow into a snowball, then a ravine, then an avalanche. So that is my message. I speak often. I spoke throughout the world. I had the blessing to see so many different communities. And I feel very comfortable to say, we can overcome it, but if you don't do it now, then the story is over. And what's happening in the United States, I'm not getting political, what happened in the United States is the beginning of the end of neo-Nazis, Christian, Aryan, haters, Jew haters, everybody that congregated on the 6th of January this year in the House of Congress in the United States, damaging it, killing people. This is the beginning. if we don't stand up worldwide against it, this will cause a tsunami. And I'm very afraid that we lose in time. If we lose time, we lose the efficacy and the time to fight against it. And I will continue to fight against it and speak up. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Dr. Wollschlaeger, thank you so much for a packed, riveting and moving story. We have a number of questions that have come in. Please do use the chat function to ask questions. They'll come directly, and I'll continue to ask them. So first of all, a statement from Monica Stern-Lobel. Your extraordinary story couldn't be made up. My father was born in Bamberg in 1926.
I know.
And he
I
escaped.
times.
Oh, wow. He escaped to England at 12 years of age. Unfortunately, his parents and brothers joined him later, but his grandmothers were in the Weißdorf ghetto and were deported and murdered, sadly, in 1942. She says, thank you for your courage in your story. A question, do you have siblings today, and do they keep in touch with you, and vice versa? By Helena Rich.
Two quick answers. Answer number one, question number one, the answer accordingly. I know Herman Löbel. I think his first name was Herman, if I recall. And I met him several times. So my heart is going out to the family, and I wish he would be among us and talk about it. Question number two, if I have siblings, yes, I do have siblings. I had actually two sisters. One sister, name was Krista, died, she was 10 years older than I am, died in 14 years ago. And I still had the opportunity to be reunited with her. And I have another sister, her name is Helga, she's 3 years younger than I am, and she lives in Bamberg, in the same city, not in the same building. And I have tried to rebuild a relationship to her, which we succeeded, and I know her children, and the children know me. So it's not a happy closure of our relationship, but we are respecting each other.
Which follows on to the question, did your family come to terms with your path? I suppose the question about your parents, I'm assuming they did not come at all to terms, or your mother maybe?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, and I will try to answer it as fast as I can and uncomplicated, Gordian knot. For my father, I was a persona non grata. I left Germany without seeing him again. He didn't want to see me. He wrote in his will that I am not part of the family anymore, and I cannot use the name Wollschlaeger. He had a military funeral and he died in June the 1st, 1987, 6 months after I left. They conducted a military funeral, and I was not there. Of course not. I was not asked to go there. And I found out about a month later that he died, which was a big blow because an only father that I had. My mother tried to intervene between both of us, between my father and me, but she did not succeed and suffered a lot with all the tension that we had at home and the screaming and the yelling. Unfortunately, I wish I would have had the opportunity to talk to them, but time moved on and I moved on.
That's a difficult chapter. Let me go to the next question. What are your feelings as to Germany and its and the society of today? And a follow-up question: has there been an acknowledgement in German society as to the Wehrmacht's role in the Holocaust?
Yes, and yes. So for the first question, Germany of today is not the Germany of yesterday. And it sounds trivial, but the Germans did and do a lot to deal with the past. Not as a one-time gig, but as an ongoing effort to educate people about Germany's dark past and glorious future, because Germany did a tremendous effort. It cannot undo and wiedergutmachen or undo anything, but it can at least show remorse and support Israel and support the Jewish community. Actually, when the former Soviet Union imploded, more than 1 million Russian Jews came through Germany to Israel, and many stayed. We have German Jewish communities is right now about 200,000 souls. Most of them are Russians. So the Russians were invited to build the Jewish community of Germany again. Question number two was about
the Wehrmacht.
Of the Wehrmacht. I'm sorry. The Wehrmacht, there are books about it. There are films made about it, that the Wehrmacht was part of the killing machine, because it was not a hidden operation. It was decided by the German government. It was agreed upon by the German government, the legitimate German government, that every part of society, part and parcel of society, should participate. And if you have not participated, of course. Now, there's a little off, and not everything is black and white. I'll give you one quick story. The Alexander von Stauffenberg, the brother of Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, he survived the war, and he married Rita von Schiller. Her parents were Protestants with Jewish background. They converted, and Melita Schiller was her name. She was a test pilot for the German army. She was fully Jewish and married Alexander von Stauffenberg, which was totally forbidden after the Nuremberg laws of 1935. They married in 1936, Dafka. She was shot. Her plane was shot down in 1945 in May by a British Spitfire, and she, just to show, we were people that were working and for the Germans in the German army who were Jews. And Goering said clearly, "Who is a Jew? I define." There were Jews, there were Germans, Jews that were Aryanized, like the General Milch, M-I-L-C-H, was a quote-unquote half-Jew, and he got the Aryanization certificate signed by Adolf Hitler that he is necessary for the German war effort, General Milch. So not everything was black and white.
It was black and white. Moving to a few thousand miles away to Israel, when and why did you leave Israel? A question's just come through.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just to clarify to everyone, you're now living in Miami.
Miami. I'm an Israeli-American citizen. I gave up my German citizenship. I arrived in Israel in 1987 in January, and I left Israel in July 1991 for residency training in Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami, which led, unfortunately, to the fact that our marriage fell apart, and we had 2 children, and I decided after 3 years to stay with my children in the United States. I go to Israel 2 or 3 times a year. Hopefully, this year will allow me to do it again. I have some professional engagements in Israel. My practice is mostly 70% Israeli. I speak Hebrew nonstop, not to the delight of my medical students who understand nothing, but we try to translate. And I will make in the next few months a decision if I go permanently back or not, because the situation is getting just unbearable here.
In terms, you're reflecting on the issue of racial tensions in America and identity politics.
Well, if that would be just that, it would be okay. But we have a very flourishing, and this is not politics, these are the facts, flourishing and developing right-wing neo-Nazi anti-Semitic group of people in the United States. 70 million of, not 70 million Americans who voted for Trump are Nazis. But Nazism and the hatred of Jews and any kind of ism that is anti-Semitism is growing and thriving. There's, for example, a member of parliament of the House of Representatives, I don't want to mention her name, last name is Harris, who is a anti-Semite core and advocates the killing of Jews. And she's a member of the House of Delegates. And the Republican Party tried to rein in one of the members of the delegation to the House of Representatives from South Florida. His name is Jimenez. He said, she's not so bad because what she said was in the past, not in the time that she's in Congress. Well, that must make it kosher then. It's a very, very bad situation. And the most thriving and active neo-Nazi communities here in South Florida, in the United States, coordinating activities via the internet with German, Polish, and Russian neo-Nazis. So it's getting bad.
And of course, you have the fact that COVID has created an economic gaping hole and can foment sort of this type of hatred and scapegoating.
Well, there are two quick anecdotes. Number one, the plague in the 13th century was attributed to the Jews, and so many Jews were murdered and slaughtered in the Rhine Valley, River Rhine Valley, because of that. Second one of the, again, Representative Harris in the House of Delegates wrote on her Facebook site, which she deleted now, that the global warming is due to the Jewish bankers who are using space lasers to heat up our planet and kill us, which is complete horse manure. But people babble it, and like Goebbels said, you just have to repeat a lie many times until it turns into a truth. That's what they do here.
Can I move on to a few more questions? We've reached
Absolutely.
8 o'clock. Yeah? Okay. Just on that point, though, I would just say, I think today's slightly different. A, we have Israel, and B, we have friends of Israel and friends of the Jewish people.
Yes.
And there's a very strong consciousness in a large segment of society, in democratic societies, and maybe not even
Absolutely.
democratic societies,
Absolutely.
of the dangers of far-right nationalism and similar movements. So in that sense, we have positive, as opposed to perhaps the Jews living in the ghettos. They were literally powerless. They had no way to determine their futures. But moving on to the question, a few more questions. Have you met any Germans whose parents were Nazis that have either converted or do similar outreach work? Because of course your story is so unique. Is there anything similar you've come across?
No, I'm not the
Or-
only one, because I would be really concerned about me doing what I'm doing. I'm just kidding. I met personally 2 Germans in Israel. One of them was is hopefully still a religious man living in Hebron and in Kiryat Arba actually. But I couldn't identify with him because I was in uniform as an officer and he was a civilian, and they didn't like us very much, the civilians. Then I met in the same area in Hebron, my commanding officer introduced me to an Arab who converted to Judaism, left his family, of course, and is a Hasid living in Jerusalem. By the way, there was a Shia, which is verified, a Shiite member of Hezbollah, who he decided to spy on Hezbollah because of all the terror that they inflicted for 20 years. And with the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, in 2000 he escaped with the Christian self-defense forces and as a Shia across the border and lives in Sfat and is an Orthodox Jew now. His son served in the Israeli army. So there are stories of people who want to make a difference and of different motivations, of course.
A question a little bit more on the personal inner journey. Where did you find the inner moral strength to embark on this extraordinary journey? Your sisters didn't take that journey. Maybe they had a different experience. But what you've described sort of the timeline, the chronology. But the question coming in is how do you understand that surge? Or is it beyond, or is it ineffable? It just is.
Well, that's a very, very important question and difficult to answer, but how many hours we have? I'm just kidding. I was being motivated by shame and guilt. Because my father, I found out more about him that he was a murderer. Give you an example, 20 years after his death, a German historian provided me, when I visited Germany and gave my first lectures 4 years ago in Bamberg to non-Jewish audiences. He approached me with a metal attaché case, and I knew him, so I was not afraid it's a bomb. And he opened it up before my first presentation and he said, "This is what you need to have." I said, "What is that?" I said, "This is an attaché suitcase that your father's late tank mechanic brought from Russia to Germany, and when he died, his children wanted you, the commander's son, to have it. Inside were torn pieces of Torah scroll wrapped in newspaper." And I said, "What does it mean?" I said, "When your father's tanks ripped into Jewish villages, killed everybody, maimed everybody, burning the synagogues, they took out the Torah scrolls, soaked them in water, cut them in strings, and used them as insulation material for German tanks in the cold Russian winter."
Gosh.
And I have it still. So guilt, shame, then curiosity about Judaism, fascination with Judaism, trying to learn about Judaism, to the conviction that I fell in love with culture, a people, a language, and I could not live with a mantle of hatred that is still hanging on me. I wanted to become a Jew. It was a long process, 7 years. There's not like a kind of a Las Vegas style drive-through conversion. This was a real tough deal, and doesn't make me better or make me worse, but it was not a straight arrow either. It was difficult at times, very difficult, because there are, for example, issues of young man once meets a non-Jewish woman, infatuated by her. That will happen to me, and knowing that there's never a relationship possible because I believe, should I do that? And so these were questions that I had to answer, and I was definitely not only with born with a halo on my head, and I'm a holy man. No, I struggled. I'm imperfect. I made mistakes. That was a very complex procedure. It changed in me.
I think what I've learned from your talk this evening is about this journey that we all go through, about embracing the light that we cast as well as the shadows, and learning how to integrate our lives to become the best version of ourselves. Because you spoke about this this transition of where you almost put your old self into a box. And I think we all do that in our lives. We have certain boxes and we place ourselves there, and as you said, you realized after a certain time it pops out even more. So we have to find a way to accept who we are, all parts of ourselves. I'd like to just add another speaker this evening, my the president of St. Hans Hebrew Congregation. We're hosting this evening, who would like to give you, Dr. Wollschlaeger, a vote of thanks. But just before he does, I also want to thank you so much for sharing your incredible, inspiring story. It's moved me, and I'm sure it has the audience, who are they were 176 strong a moment ago. So I'm going to add Robert Pincus, the president of St. Hans Hebrew Congregation.
Thank you.
Hold on a second. I'll just unmute you, Robert. You're unmuted. Robert and Ingrid, yes.
Dr. Wollschlaeger, I consider it a very great privilege to say a big thank you on behalf of Rabbi Bernd, our community, and the other guests in the audience who've listened to your remarkable and probably unique story. I can't imagine how difficult it was for you to break away from your family, which obviously needed a great amount of courage. On the one hand, it is heartening for us to know that there are people who have confronted the past and done something about it, as you have. But on the other hand, a worry that there are still many who are ambivalent, or worse, who don't want to confront it.
Yeah.
Your story is so remarkable that it has the capacity to reach audiences who may not have an interest in the Holocaust, and your work in telling your story will, I'm sure, help to educate many youngsters in Holocaust education, and maybe throw some more light on what caused it.
Thank you.
So, once again, Dr. Wollschlaeger, our very sincere thanks.
Thank you.
I'm muted. Thank you so much again, Dr. Wollschlaeger, for your time, answering so candidly and openly. We wish you bracha v'hatzlacha, blessing and success in all the work you do, both as a doctor on the front line, dealing with difficult situations, as well as this important work that you're doing, sharing yourself, your story with the world. Thank you so much as well to everybody from St. Hans and around the UK for joining us this evening. This will be put online at some point, so you can get in touch with the synagogue if you want to receive the recording. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.